we are thrilled that we were able to lure Michele back in an official capacity. As most of you know, this time last year she was promoted from staff member to volunteer, which really means she retired after a very distinguished career as a librarian and genealogy researcher. The museum has been so pleased to have her talents in building the Genealogy Center into what it is today. And so we invited her, knowing that she's still in the area, to come and share maybe some of the more memorable stories that she came across in researching so many different people's ancestral roots over the years. So without further ado, Michele.
Thank you, Tova. Hello to all of you. Many familiar faces out there. I'm going to try and see if I can hold this and.
Or you could try moving it.
Try moving it
close to you.
But I may be turning this way.
Then
so we'll try it this way anyway. If you can't hear, if you can't hear, is it on? Yeah. Okay. I'll try and hold it closer to me. Most of our Danish ancestors were Lutheran farmers who led an ordinary life. At least that's the picture that we get an awful lot when you're doing research. But every once in a while, you find surprises. And so when Tova was asking me what kind of a topic I'd like to talk with, this is one that came up. And I thought I'd share with you a bit some of the surprises that, or surprise stories that I have come across in the time I've been working at the Genealogy Center. Surprises, of course, are things you don't expect. And they can be fun, happy ones, they can be sad ones, or just interesting ones. And I thought what I'd do is start with a surprise that I found in my own family tree. I think you recognize this person, Hans Christian Andersen. He was an author and a traveler during his lifetime. One of the family stories that I grew up with.
I'm not sure what's going on, but
See if we can try again. No? No. Try 3 times. That's louder. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. One of the family stories I grew up with was that we were descendants of Hans Christian Andersen. And of course, as a small child, that was sort of very exciting. Well, Hans Christian Andersen, of course, although he frequently fell in love with women that he never really, they were unattainable in various reasons, he never married, and it's extremely doubtful that he ever fathered any children. So one of the problems that I had to work through was, if the story was true, where would I find the linkage? And it would be, when I counted back generations, about my great-great-grandfather's generation. Well, when I was 18, I went to Denmark for the first time, and I was fortunate enough to meet the little sister of my Danish immigrant grandmother, Hansina, and found out that they said that they were descendants of another famous Danish author named Johannes Ewald, who is this gentleman here. And I thought, well, okay, my name of one of her children, Ewald. So that sounded like there was some truth to this. And so I thought, well, okay, over here in America, nobody knows Johannes Ewald. So we're descended from a famous Danish author. Who do you think of? Hans Christian Andersen, right? So I kept this in the back of my mind. Ewald was a late 18th century Danish poet and dramatist, and he wrote the lyrics for King Christian Stood by the High Mast, one of the Danish national anthems. He's a son of a vicar, but he was very much a bohemian and an alcoholic. He had at least one unrequited love affair, but he never married, died quite young, as you can tell, and is not known to have fathered any children. But if the story is true, the linkages should be back maybe at my 4th great-grandfather's level in your family tree. So I kept that in the back of my mind and started working on my own genealogy. And I got back to the birth record of a great-great-grandfather named Johannes Johansson in Faaborg. He was born in Faaborg in 1833, and I found his birth record. And it was a very sad entry because birth records in the Danish church books give your birth date, your baptismal date generally, list the parents and the godparents, and then give sometimes some other information.
Try this one.
Okay. Hopefully. On this particular record, here's Johannes, born in 1883, and where godparents are given, it says that the mother carried the child for baptism because she couldn't find anyone to stand up with her. That was unusual type of record or note. Normally there's anywhere between 3 and 6 godparents. Her parents were given as, Johannes' parents were given as Valborg Katrina, the widow of a tailor named Johansson, and the father was named Rasmus Christensen Evald. The V and W were pronounced the same, so that was the same. So I thought, whoa, okay, this is a possibility. Can't possibly be connected to Johannes Evald, the author, because he lived in the greater Copenhagen area, and this is in Faaborg on the island of Funen. But I now had a name of one of my 3rd great-grandfathers, and it was named Evald, so I went searching for him. The following year, in 1834, there was a census taken in Denmark, and I was able to find Johannes Johansson as a 1-year-old living with his mother and several older siblings, and they were living in the poorhouse in Faaborg, and she was listed as a widow, which corresponded with Johannes's birth certificate. Okay, where is Papa at this point in time? So looking through the census records, I found him still in Faaborg, listed as married, a day laborer and a lodger in a household with, even though he's married, there's no wife or children living with him. And further searching back in time, I found him and his wife and the children by his wife, all living in the poorhouse about, a little shortly before this census was taken. I don't know if he got kicked out or he finally decided he wanted to work or something like that. But anyway, he apparently was living in the next room in the poorhouse compared to the woman who became the mother of their joint child. Well, searching a little bit more for Rasmus, I came up with the 1850 census, and I found him in jail in Nyborg, the town of Nyborg. And he was listed as, they call the inmates slaves in the jail. And doing some research on the jail, I found out that the jail was next to the fortress in Nyborg. And so a lot of times jail inmates were put to work building or repairing the various structures that were part of the fortress. Here he's listed, this is 16 years after that previous census. He's divorced, and actually his first wife is still in the poorhouse with her, her remaining kids who are still young. He seemed to go in and out, however. So anyway, when I looked for more records about, well, why was he in jail? There had to be a reason. I was lucky that the Mormons had microfilmed records, and so I ordered them in and found out that he was in jail because he had defaced his skuthmosbo. This is a employment record book or a character reference book that all working class people had to carry with them at all times and present whenever they moved in or out of employment. And there was very stringent rules for what happened if you lost your book or defaced it in some way. So I have no idea what happened to him, but I suspect he may have been staggering down the street and dropped it in a mud puddle or something like that. Or perhaps tore some pages out, you don't know. But I was able to find his jail record here, Rasmus Christensen Evald, listed in 1854, and it says that he's got big chains with an iron collar. And he's got 2 crimes here. Both of them were associated with the fact that he was set out to work for either the fortress, with the other inmates, and came home drunk, or he was also hired out privately another time here, and again came home drunk. So his additional penalties also resulted in his being put on bread and water for periods of time, as well as having this chain around his neck or who knows what. So I have this illustrious ancestor in my family tree that has nothing to do with Hans Christian Andersen or even Johannes Evald. He was just definitely a ne'er-do-well as far as I can tell. So what I thought I'd do is show you some of the stories now that I've come across that have appealed to me when I've been doing genealogy. And we'll start in Arizona with Hans and Christina Christiansen. A patron of ours or somebody was traveling through Arizona and stopped in the town of Tombstone and went to the Boot Hill Cemetery and found the markers for a Hans Christiansen who died in 1891 and Christina who died, it says 92, but it turns out it was 93, in the cemetery. Just very simple markers, and wrote to us and wanted to know if we had any information about them. Well, that piqued our curiosity as well, so we did a little bit of digging around in various resources and found out that in 1880, in the territorial census of Arizona, there was an H.M. Christiansen who was 29 and a farmer who was living in the Tombstone era. And he seems, we feel pretty confident that he is a Hans Morten Christiansen who came from Lindknut Parish in Leba County and immigrated to this country in 1873. We found out that in 1882 he applied for U.S. citizenship and received it, and about that same time he apparently sent for his sweetheart back in Denmark named Christina Beck. And before Christina and her older sister Johanna came to this country, Christina had this photograph taken in Obenro of what she looked like at that point in time. They came to the US and Christina married Hans, and they got a 160-acre farm near the San Pedro River in the area, and it was called the Danish Ranch. They raised cattle and they did general farming. Well, if any of you are familiar with Tombstone, Arizona, you know there were lots of gunfights and stabbings and all sorts of things. So when I first saw this tombstone, I thought, oh dear, I bet he was on the wrong end of a bullet or something. But later research showed that he actually died of pneumonia. So not very interesting at all. But at least, it wasn't something terrible. I mean, if he had been stabbed, he might have gotten written up in the newspaper a little bit more than he did. 2 years later, his wife, Christina, died from, according to the coroner's report, the administering of arsenical poison. There was a coroner's jury, and another Danish immigrant was originally charged with the death, but it was thrown out of court for lack of evidence. But we were able to find out that The couple, in the short time that they were married, had 3 sons, and they were raised by Christina's sister, who had also married and lived in the area in a town called Gleason, which is now one of Arizona's ghost towns. And the ranch that Hans and Christina originally were operating was run by one of their sons, and then also continued in the family until sometime in the 1970s. So even though they had a sad ending, rather abruptly, to their story, the family did survive and thrive over here. This lovely drawing was made by Fritz Place, who lived in Omaha. There's a Danish term called an original, and it refers to a person who simply does not march to the usual drum beat that everybody else does. And, you know, a person who's just off on the side in terms of society. Sometimes they're accepted and, you know, with shrugs by the social environment, and sometimes they really are so odd that they, you know, often are just ignored. But Frederick Christian Place, who was the son of a forester, was one of these originators. He was born in 1845 outside of Aarhus, and appears to be exceptionally well educated for his time, or he must have been also very self-educated through his lifetime. In 1866, he immigrated to Omaha with a brother named Adolphus, or Adolf, and he bought 80 acres near Florence. And there was a creek, or a small river, on the property, and he dammed it up to make a lake called Place Lake. And then he built a 7-room building. Now, the very interesting thing with this building is that it was 7 stories tall, apparently. I've not seen a drawing of it, just I've heard it described a couple of times. So he got a lot of exercise going up and down to the various rooms. and he had a farm on the property, and apparently he had dreams of flying. So in 1881, he built the machine that you see in the sketch here, and I realize in the back you're not going to see a lot of detail. There's a person sitting in the middle, right here, and apparently you attach your arms and your legs to various parts of the device, and you flap them or move them to fly. So this was his initial idea that seemed to work. So he decided to try it out, but he didn't want to do it himself, so he got his brother Adolf to do it. And the property had some bluffs. You know, it wasn't all just flat plain on the property north of Omaha. Well, Adolf did it and ended up with a broken leg. Later on, Fritz himself tried it out after making some alterations, and he got dumped into his lake, apparently. But he kept tinkering with this idea and other ones too. And so he's written up fairly frequently in some of the Omaha newspapers about this. But notoriety, or this oddballness, followed him along. Some years later, he was cleaning his gun and accidentally killed his brother, Adolf. And he was very sad about this, so he bought a very, very fine casket and buried him on his property. 10 years later, his sister died, but he couldn't afford a casket for her. And he remembered the one that he had buried Adolf in, so he dug up his brother, wrapped the bones in a quilt and reburied them, and reused the casket for his sister. This made national headlines in the New York Times and the Louisiana, New Orleans Post-Dispatch. And he was quite surprised that all the attention he got for doing this. Like, why would anybody care? He predicted that flying machines would definitely become a reality. And unfortunately, he died in 1910, and just a few years before they were used extensively in World War I, of course. And he's buried in Springwell Cemetery in Omaha, so if any of you ever go out there, you might look for his tombstone. Priest Lake, that he had dammed up and was for many years apparently a very popular picnic site for especially Danes in the Omaha area, but later on the dam was broken down and you can't even find the lake on current maps right now. Walter Lanius Denker here came to the U.S. at age 17 and joined the U.S. Army as soon as he turned 21. Started out as a private and worked his way up the ranks. And in 1918, when he was in Hawaii, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant. And then 20 minutes later, he was promoted to first lieutenant and assigned to the Philippines, where he served several tours of duty training Filipino soldiers. Periodically, he got home leave, of course, and went back to Denmark to visit his family. And he did so in 1926, and he met Ellen, his wife, at a dance. Danced every dance with her, and then the next morning came to her house and proposed. They had a 2-week courtship. Obviously, her father and mother were not particularly happy at saying goodbye to their daughter when she'd end up all the way on the other side of the world, not just in America, but in the Philippines. But they had a 2-week courtship. They got a kongablave, which was a special permission to get married without posting the banns in the church 3 times like you normally did, because he didn't have enough time left on his leave. And then they left Denmark immediately after their wedding. So their honeymoon was on the steamship, the Heliola, here. And they were taken care of quite nicely by the crew because they were on their honeymoon. After they got to the United States, they took the train overland to San Francisco, and then they took an Army transport ship to Manila. This was a big, you think for Ellen, this was a big leap. She couldn't easily go home to Mama, if it didn't work out. But the marriage turned out very happy, and they had at least 1 child. And everything was very nice until 1941, when World War II was imminent, and all American civilians were evacuated from the Philippines. So Ellen and her daughter ended up in San Francisco to wait out the war. Lieutenant Denker, and I think he was a colonel by this point, was captured on the Bataan Peninsula, however, and he was interned in several Japanese prison camps. And then in December of 1944, he was put on a Japanese prison ship, and it was sailing to Japan, and it was bombed by American planes and sank. The ship sank. And according to the stories we have, he and several others clung to debris trying to reach the shore, but there was machine gun fire which prevented them from doing so, and so he lost his life. This has a slightly different take on love. In the middle of 1906, Anna Petrea Barents and her fiancé, Jørn Rasmussen, sailed from Aalborg to Harlan, Iowa, via Liverpool and Halifax, Nova Scotia. And once they got to Harlan, they married. They raised 6 sons and lived a happy life, presumably, until Jørn's death in the 1940s. Meanwhile, back in Denmark, in Helberskov, there was a widower named Jens Justesen, and he decided that he wanted to see the world a bit after farming for such a long time, so he turned over his farm to his son and decided to come to America to visit one brother who had immigrated and also several old schoolmates. One of these latter schoolmates was a man named Marinus Sørensen, who resided in Harlan. And after Jens had arrived, Marinus invited Anna Petrea over for dinner. And according to Justesen, he was quoted as, "That's what happens when one starts a fire in an old house." So 47 years after Anna Petrea crossed the Atlantic with a fiancé to get married. She found herself going the opposite direction, and she and Jens were married on Ascension Sunday in Aalborg in 1953. This is a picture of Niels Christian Sørensen, who was a city policeman in Racine, Wisconsin. And he was written up in newspapers very frequently as being very reliable and conscientious as an officer. And after a few years on the force, he married another immigrant who had come over named Wilhelmina Christina Lorenzina Christensen. And then he retired from the police force shortly thereafter because he was beginning to go deaf. And a deaf policeman isn't so particularly useful. So he opened a wine and a tobacco establishment in Racine. But it didn't work out so well, particularly, so Minnie began taking in boarders to make ends meet. In December of 1896, both of them were very active in the Racine Danish community, including Danish Brotherhood and the Genealogy and a lot of other organizations. In 1896, she was elected treasurer of an organization called the Women's 10-Cent Aid Society. And it was a Danish-American women's group that was formed to assist poor and needy city residents. A little over a half year later, she hit the headlines here. She had embezzled $1,135 from the 10-Cent Society. And the reason was she was hoping to help her husband regain his hearing through some sort of medical procedure, and she was hoping to repay the money before anybody missed it. But that didn't happen. After some time, the case was settled out of court after the Sorensens proposed a repayment schedule, and it was accepted. And they continued on with their life. In January of 1901, Niels Christian and his brother were both in a runaway wagon accident, and Niels lost his leg above the knee and died of shock 3 days later. So Minnie was left with 3 children, but she had a Danish Brotherhood life insurance policy. And that meant that she could maintain her boarding house and wouldn't be completely destitute and be the recipient of one of these 10-cent societies alms or money that they would give them. So her boarding house became very popular and apparently became a temporary home for scores of Danish immigrants who came to Racine until she remarried in 1917. And when she died in 1930, she was once more in the papers, but this time she was celebrated as one of Racine's pioneer immigrant women. Isn't this guy cute? This is Theodor Frederik Jensen Schnoor. I wish I had a clear photo of my ancestors from this time period. He was born in 1888 in Odense, and the son of a greengrocer, and he immigrated to the United States in 1906, settled in New Jersey, married, had 2 kids, moved to Rhode Island, and from what we could tell, led a completely uneventful life until he died in 1970. But the existence of this photo leads to a backstory, because it was found in a book that documented the use of mirrors in police photography in Denmark to capture both the front and the side view of miscreants, as you can tell there. So, this was taken in Vejle in 1906, so shortly before he immigrated. And apparently this young man, Theodor, was apprenticed in his father's grocery for several years, and then sent over to Vejle from Odense to a colleague to gain more experience. But, teenagers are faced with temptation and they don't always make good decisions. And so he made a bad one and was arrested by the Vejle police for petty theft. But this was his first account, and he had an unblemished record, so he was given a suspended sentence, providing he kept out of trouble for 5 years. And his father decided, I can't deal with this anymore, so he purchased him a one-way ticket to the United States. Yeah. And as he said, you know, this may be the best photograph ever taken of him, who knows. It's one of many in the book that we have in the Genealogy Center about the use of the photography by the Danish police. And it's a fascinating book, but of course it's in Danish, so. This is Thomas Peterson. He was one of 13 children from Eru, and 8 of them immigrated to the United States. And he came over in 1897. He had had an aunt and an uncle over here in Minnesota already, and they gave him 200 kroner to pay for his passage. And it took him a year of working in the cornfields of the Midwest to pay them back, but he did. Later, he did forestry jobs and drove a horse-drawn stagecoach, and apparently wandered around quite a bit. In 1925, he returned to Denmark to live with a sister in his childhood home. But he brought back with him this complete Native American outfit, from headdress to moccasins, which had been made especially for him by some tribe, which has not come down in history anyway. And every fast allowance, he would put on the costume and walk around the streets of the town. And the local children loved that, of course. And when he died, his casket was accompanied to the churchyard by masked children making the usual fast allowance spectacle or noise. No one knows what happened to this gorgeous Indian dress, however. I don't know if it's in the museum over there or not. This was a couple that I just love the picture of. This is Valdemar Marius Theobald Jensen, also from Fyn. He worked for the Danish railroad system after serving in the Navy. And Tora, on the right, she was a dairymaid in Denmark, and she had to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning every day to milk 25 cows and make cheese from the milk, and then do it again later on in the day. But both of them managed to have enough energy to go to a dance hall occasionally, and they met each other and fell in love at first sight. So they married as soon as Valdemar turned 21. In 1909, they had been married for 10 years and they had 4 children, and they decided to immigrate to the United States. And they had a fairly rocky trip over, apparently with a lot of seasickness, and most of what they served in steerage at that time was cabbage soup, which was not particularly appetizing when you were trying to keep your stomach down. One of their daughters was Carla, who was 10 years old, and of course she was down in steerage, and she kept trying to creep up to the top, decks, because she wanted to see the ocean. Can you imagine sailing across the Atlantic and not seeing the ocean one time? And she kept being caught and sent down to where she belonged, except when the ship passed the Statue of Liberty. They let her up to see that. They came to Audubon and lived there. And Valdemar always wore his railroad coat, which is this one you can see him dressed in, for Sunday best, and it had silver buttons on it. And people used to come to town and they'd see him in it, and they'd touch their hat or their forelock to him when they saw him in this fancy coat with the buttons. And so he eventually took the buttons off and replaced them with ordinary ones and gave buttons to each of his children to keep. He was one of the longtime subscribers to the Danish Pioneer newspaper, and it had advantages besides knowing what's going on back home. This is where he learned that his parents had died because of the news from back home section of the paper. one interesting sort of side story to this is that the mother of Torah was an illegitimate, actually she was a foster child and had been born in Copenhagen to a very, very poor family, and presumably, I know both of her parents died of typhoid fever when she was quite young, which is why she and her siblings were fostered out. But there is a story that her mother was the illegitimate daughter of a Danish king currently. And there is a photograph of her and also of the king who would have been in reigning at the time that the mother was born, and they look very similar to each other. But we done some research and tried to find out, and I also bought a book for the Genealogy Center that dealt with all the Danish monarchs and their mistresses and children to see if we could find any links to them, and weren't able to come up with anything. And we've occasionally had people come in and say that they've got a family story about being related to royalty, but we've never actually ever found that to be the case. When you're a genealogist, you're told very early on not to get hung up on names and how they're spelled. You know, people say, my name is Smith, S-M-I-T-H. I'm never a S-M-Y-T-H, you know. And that is a big mistake that, you know, beginning genealogists do. There are many reasons why names can be spelled variously. They can be, in our case, it could be because people speak with an accent. It could be just misreading of handwriting, incorrect transcriptions of records, and just plain ingenuity completely that can lead to some surprising names. And so I thought I'd share some of my favorites surprising this way. And one of them was Mette Schmidt. He was placed on the Wall of Honor at some point in time under that name, Mette Schmidt. But I could tell at least that something that wasn't the name he was born with. You know, it was Schmidt maybe, but not his first given name. So we started working through all the records we could find in this country and found 11 different ones, all with different spellings of either the first name or the last name, or both, going back to the 1900 census. We were unable to find his marriage, so we don't know how that showed up. But from the 1900 census, we knew his month and year of birth. We also knew roughly when he came to this country. So we also searched in Denmark to see if we could match him up. And we were eventually successful, although it did take some time. So there are two possibilities for when he arrived, in 1882 or 1884, but they both gave the name that looks like Math Schmidt with the German spelling. Working back from that, we finally found him in the 1880 Danish census as Matthias Schmidt with an E. 1870, he was Matthias Schmidt with an I. In the 1860 census, he was Matthiesen Schmidt, German spelling. And so finally, we worked our way back to his birth and baptismal record in Haderslev County, where he was Matthiesen Schmidt, and that's how he started out, which corresponded to that very first census that was taken the following year. So, you know, it's not always easy when you're trying to track back to your where in Denmark your ancestors came from, to be able to go right to them and identify it, their place of origin. And people who don't do genealogy sometimes say, why? You're spending all this time, you didn't find anything? You know, why? That's partly why. This was something that I thought was sort of interesting. Occasionally, you know, many times there are common names, like Niels Sørensen, Hans Peterson, Jens Hansen, and it's hard to discriminate between the people, especially if they're in the same parish that you're looking at. In a few records, I found people with their name and the elder, the younger, next to them, such as in this 1801 census, we have a Niels Sørensen the older, who's 47, living in this parish, and Niels Sørensen the younger, who's 25, in the same community. And then I found a Niels Sørensen, the middle one, who's 28, also in the same little town. And actually, they were living within 10 households of each other. And besides these three, in the parish, in this year, there were 5 other Niels Sørensens as well. You know, some very old and some younger. But I thought that was sort of interesting. Many of you know that a lot of Danish female names are variants on a man's name, like Hansina is from Hans, and Petrina from Peter. And so, you know, anytime you say a female name with Ina on, most chances you usually can find the male name that it comes from, such as these first two, Gottfriedina and Balthasarina, you know, from Gottfried and Balthasar. But I thought that this one, Bombardina, was very intriguing. And in the Napoleonic Wars, the British-English fleet bombarded Copenhagen. And she was born about shortly thereafter. And apparently her inventive parents wanted to commemorate the occasion, or perhaps she was born during the bombardment. Anyway, but that's one of the more unusual ones I've come. A lot of, in the late 19th century, especially in the market towns and cities, women and to a certain extent men were given 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 given names, such as this is my great aunt Anna Johanna Paulina Ludovica Mortensen, you know, and she went by, when she came to this country, Pauline. I found this woman Skuldfri, which means innocent, Duleviat, which looks to me like it might have a Dutch origin surname unless somebody's really garbled up the spelling. Sometimes spellings are just variants, probably because of the dialects that were spoken throughout Denmark at the time. So there you have Rebecca, spelled with a B-E-C-H-E. This one here, her name has got her title, Madame, in front of her actual name. But there was, you know, in the census record, it's given this way, whereas generally speaking, you don't have titles. It's in, you know, the information is placed somewhere else in the record. This one I've never been able, Egil Betryka to Wilhelmina Sindig, I've never been able to figure out what that name is supposed to be. Ivan Eugene Millibald Friedrich Baumann, and his little brother Guido Sophia Werner Baumann. You know, I'm not, you know, they're both were given as male children, but a little bit odd. Or Edvard Madsenius Jugeliot, I guess, Rasmussen. So you encounter things that you don't expect, and then you sometimes have to work out, well, is this correct? Or, you know, what's the variant spelling? One of the ones I enjoyed, there's a name called Dusinius that crops up in names fairly frequently, or a female version, Dusinia or Dusinia, and it's not too uncommon, and often references dozen, or maybe that this is a 12th child in a family, or they hope it's the last one. But this one I ran across not too long ago, where he's Elebinus Fjortinus Peter Christensen, or number 14. So I went to, you know, I just couldn't leave it like that. And I thought, this must be misspelled. So I went to the actual birth record for him, and sure enough, it's all spelled correctly, Elebinus. But when I, you know, totaled up the children in the household through various censuses and stuff like that, I could only come up with 7. You know, whether there were ones that were died young, perhaps, or maybe they just were wishful thinking on the parents' part. You know, you can't tell. This was another family that I found rather interesting. You know, rural Danish families often were terribly large. You know, there wasn't any birth control, and there was also a need for as many hands as you could get, so you didn't have to hire help. And this is a parish called N-O, in Ringkøbing County. And we were researching in Anders Peter Lauritsen, born in 1885, who immigrated to Iowa. And going back into his family history, we found that his parents were married in 1879, and they had 21 children in 26 years. Anders Peter was the only half of the only set of twins. He and his twin are over here. And this is at least 5 of the kids did end up immigrating to North America. But this was the family picture that was taken before the immigration started. And after seeing this photo, you cannot say that there are no Lauritsens in No. A lot of times, those of us who work at the Genealogy Center sort of tear our hair out, you know, wondering where we can find the records, so they just don't pop up immediately. I was looking for an immigrant named Carl Madsen, who was born in 1866, and I was going through Ancestry or family search, looking for possibilities, and I ran across this entry, and it was just too good to pass up. It's from the transcription of the 1916 census for Ringkøbing in Denmark. And I thought, what name could this possibly be? So I went to the actual record, and turns out he's skuespiller, Carl Madsen, which means actor. And over in the next column with his occupation, it said skuespiller, actor. So somehow the census taker wrote down he was the only one in this household who had his occupation put in front of his name. When many times the people who are indexing these records, you know, they don't necessarily know the language, and they may not have any context. They just get a little snippet like this to index. And so somebody had translated that into skuespiller. One of the other things that I'm fascinated with is obituaries, and I'll conclude with this. I think most obituaries are pretty boring, so please, when you die, will you please write a good one for yourselves, you know, so that it isn't just, oh hum, you know, born to this person or this family, live in such and such a thing. We were doing research recently for a Danish female immigrant who was on the Wall of Honor, and ran into the fact that she had married a Dutchman in this country. Actually, they were married in Denmark and came over to their family. And her obituary was the usual one like you'll see up here at the church, you know, on the back of those little cards. Not, you know, informative, but not interesting at all. But this one, the husband, I just loved, and I'd like to conclude with the end part of it, you know, where it goes through all the usual information about when he was born and when he came to this country, etc., etc. And then it says, he was a member of such and such a church. He was preceded in death by 3 of his brothers and 3 brothers-in-law, as well as by Adam and Eve and billions of members of the human family. So he had no illusion that death would pass him by. Besides, living past the age of 100 did not appeal to him. He received 3 things in life that are of basic importance: someone to love, something to do, something to look forward to. And he was thankful. And thank you for listening.